In the future, granted we overcome climate catastrophe, I think future human societies are going to look back at us and mock us relentlessly for ever thinking we had an independent and objective news media. Oh, hey, look at me, I'm some dork from the early 21st century. And isn't it super cool our news media is privately owned and controlled? That's just legal. And these business owners can print whatever they want, whenever they want, hire and fire whoever, and it's totally okay? Isn't it super cool they get to privately dominate the whole process of news production? Very objective and independent. Oh, what's this? Weapons of mass destruction? Now that's an invasion I consent to. There is a widespread conception that our news media is objective, that in general, our news media can be trusted to present reality truthfully. This is a delusion. Upon careful examination of the news media's character, history, and record, it becomes painfully clear that our news media presents a deeply biased and distorted view of reality. And it's within this presented frame of reality that discussion, debate, and decisions are to be had and made. Anything which falls outside of this frame is to be denounced as out of touch with reality, to be slandered as unrealistic, as biased, and unobjective. Certainly, debate and disagreement can be intense within this frame, but this intensity and heat should not be naively mistaken for a free and objective press. And as this video will come to show, it's ultimately because our news media is privately owned and operated under capitalism, which is responsible for this distortion and narrowing of reality towards this capitalist frame. Before delving too deeply into all of this, I want to stress just how important of a role the news media plays within society. For the vast majority, especially those who don't follow politics so closely, it's the news media which informs our conceptions of reality beyond our immediate experiences and beyond our social networks. Right, so most people just don't have the luxury of time and hordes of wealth needed to travel around and draw their own independent understanding of reality. They are dependent on the news media. So this role that the news media plays in depicting reality beyond our social horizon comes with a countless number of unavoidable editorial choices. What events are and are not newsworthy, which sources are to be trusted and which sources are to be dismissed, what facts are to be presented and what facts are to be omitted, how said facts are to be presented and in what light, and even how often a fact or topic is repeated and covered. All these editorial choices over how the larger world is depicted contributes to the framing of reality. Now, these presented conceptions about the wider world bear real consequences on the decisions people might make in their personal lives. Oh, well, I've been informed that so-and-so country is a threat to world peace or has an authoritarian regime, and thus this coup or war is justified, and so I'm not going to protest it. And these conceptions don't just influence the decisions people might make, they also influence how people might interpret their own immediate experiences. I've just lost my job. It's not because of my boss, it's my own fault. The economy is changing and I didn't learn to code. Or I lost my job because the immigrants took it, or because China is evil. So I hope it's clear just how important of a role the news media plays within society. The power over how reality is presented. Before examining how the news media distorts reality towards a capitalist frame, it's important we come to understand what is meant by this capitalist frame of reality. Now, our news media does not exist within a vacuum. Our news media exists firmly within a capitalist economy, and as such we need to come to understand capitalism, and I promise you this is going to be quick. Under capitalism, the stuff that produces stuff, factories, land, equipment, natural resources, etc., are privately owned and operated in pursuit of private profit. All other considerations are subordinate to this pursuit of private profit. Not out of any kind of callousness or ill will, but out of economic necessity. To prioritize the environment over profit, or the needs of society, or any code of morality over profit, is to jeopardize the economic viability of your business, risk defaulting on accumulated debt, and to face being outcompeted by those more ruthlessly persistent and unyielding in their drive towards profit. This is the context in which our news media exists. An economy whose vast resources are privately dominated and mobilized in the sole pursuit of private profit. And a news media which itself is a business, privately owned and operated for profit. Now, for the schlubs who don't own the means of production, the overwhelming majority of society, in order to survive, they must labor on the capitalist's productive property in exchange for a wage, producing goods and services for the capitalist to be sold. The surplus value generated by the worker in the course of production is the origin of profit for the capitalist. The worker seeks to keep as much of the value they have generated as possible in seeking higher wages, cutting into the capitalist's profit. Ideally for the worker, this relationship of exploitation would be abolished altogether. The capitalist seeks to take as much of the value generated as possible in seeking to lower wages, maximizing their profit. Ideally for the capitalist, this relationship of exploitation would be maintained in perpetuity. These are diametrically opposed material interests, in which there is no resolution under the capitalist mode of production. For the worker to keep more of the value, the capitalist must lose. For the capitalist to take more of the value, the worker must lose. So what might be viewed as a positive development from the standpoint of a worker will genuinely be viewed as a negative development from the standpoint of a capitalist. Let's turn to a simple example to illustrate this point. A strike has occurred and the workers have managed to gain concessions from their employers, namely a raise in pay. If you ask the worker and the capitalist what happened, you're going to get two very different stories. One will tell you the workers rightfully stood up and demanded a living pay, and the other will tell you that the workers, in pursuing their greed, have hurt the economy. These different conceptions about what happened are drawn not because one is dumber than the other and just can't see reality properly. Rather, it is their material interests which shape their perceptions. Now, going back to those unavoidable editorial choices that must be made when presenting reality, the worker and capitalist are going to make very different choices, reflecting what each is more concerned about. If asked to describe the health of an economy, the worker might focus on the affordability of necessities, their wages, housing quality, etc., whereas the capitalist would make a different editorial decision, instead focusing on interest rates, stock market growth, GDP, and so on. In describing an economy with skyrocketing market growth, but increasingly more expensive necessities and stagnant wages, you're going to get two very different answers, reflecting a capitalist frame of reality and a worker's frame of reality. Now, under capitalism, it's not the workers who own the means of mass communication. It's not the workers who get to shape the dominant perceptions about reality. Our means of mass communication under capitalism are privately owned and are going to present a dominant capitalist understanding of reality. Different news media outlets may report a given story differently, but these variations in how capitalist media report stories merely reflect the particular material interests of the owners. President whatever has announced they've placed tariffs on X country's steel products. If you're a news media capitalist with investments and interests tied up in the domestic steel industry, this story is going to be reported very positively by your news outlet, with whatever justifications for this positive reporting that can be found. If you're a news media capitalist with interests, for whatever reason, tied up in industries that rely on cheap steel, your news media outlet will report these stories very negatively, with whatever justifications and rationalizations that can be found. But despite these disagreements, both these owners share a common interest as capitalists, and their outlets will remain firmly within a capitalist frame of reality. Now that we have a sense of what is meant by a capitalist frame of reality, it's time we turn our attention to how such a frame is formed. If we want to understand how the capitalist frame is formed, we need to recognize that the news media is tiered, with lower tiers reiterating the stories and breaks of the week covered by the top tiers of news media. Top-tier news outlets within the United States, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, have an incredible power to set the national and even international tone and agenda. These top-tier news outlets overwhelmingly and disproportionately dictate the perceptions about the wider world that get disseminated, and the dynamics we will be discussing, which form a capitalist frame of reality, become increasingly more pronounced and inexorable with higher and higher tiers of media. So yes, there will be news outlets who manage to present reality outside this capitalist frame, but these smaller news outlets are not the ones shaping people's conceptions about the wider world. They are not the ones setting the popular and dominant frame of reality. They are among its victims, slandered as biased, unrealistic, and not credible. Alright, we're going to start off with the most blunt and overt powers which narrows news coverage towards a capitalist frame. By virtue of private ownership over the means of mass communication, news media owners are completely free to hire and fire whoever they want, on whatever basis, and are free to promote and demote whoever they want on whatever basis. Under capitalism, this is their legal right, and there's nothing you can do about it. Besides maybe a workers' revolution. In staffing their news media ventures, a capitalist, with all their biases and their acute focus on maximizing profit, is, for example, not going to hire a journalist who freely criticizes the capitalist mode of production, who traces societal ailments back to capitalism. Putting aside the fact that said journalism would offend the personal biases of the capitalists, such a journalist would jeopardize profit margins by discouraging advertisers and attracting the wrong kind of audience, namely a significantly less profitable audience. Instead, the kind of journalists we see hired are those who do not offend the material interests of the capitalist, whether because these journalists have learned to bite their tongue if they want a job, or because they are genuine in their support of the capitalist's material interests. Now, under the employment of the owner, the journalist is granted what's been termed conditional autonomy. The journalist is free to report however they like, free from any kind of crass censorship by the owners and editors, so long as their reporting remains within an approved frame, so long as their reporting does not offend the material interests of the owners. Due to the hiring process, many journalists are more than happy to reside within this frame and might never feel the terms of condition for their autonomy. These are the journalists who will tell you the press is free and sincerely believe it, and in a sense they'd be right. Those members of the press who do not violate their conditions of autonomy genuinely experience a sense of autonomy. Without moving, they never feel their chains. Now, for those pesky journalists who do end up violating their conditions of autonomy by stepping outside an approved frame, the owner's legal powers of firing, promoting, and demoting can be used to enforce said conditions. John the journalist has a very prestigious position of covering the happenings of the financial world, and in a recent series of news pieces he's written, he's begun covering financial abuses not as isolated incidents whose fault lies squarely at the feet of bad individuals, but as emblematic of a deeper and systematic fault with our financial system. Now, for whatever reason, the outlet's owner has material interests wrapped up in the financial sector, whether because they themselves have investments in this sector, or their advertisers are somehow involved in the financial sector. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is that John's systematic critique of the financial sector falls outside the owner's approved frame, and thus John has violated a condition of his autonomy. John will very quickly find himself moved to covering lesser stories and beats, and just as quickly John will learn that if he wants to keep prestigious positions, build his career portfolio, and keep earning a decent living, he needs to be wary of what buttons not to press. In the same vein, those more dogged in their respect for the material interests of the owners will find themselves promoted to higher and higher posts within the company. Now, say John insists on reporting outside the approved frame, consistently violating the terms of his autonomy, believing it is his duty as a journalist to speak truth to power, to tell it like it is, to be a voice for the voiceless. John's gonna be fired. Simple as that. An act fully within the legal right of the owners. Now, the powers of hiring, firing, promoting, and demoting all come together and contribute to a much more subtle and effective dynamic which keeps journalists and their news coverage within a capitalist frame, what's been termed self-censorship. Through the course of their career, journalists come to recognize what is expected from them and what is discouraged. These lessons can be picked up from the heavy hand of demotions and promotions, but also from the subtle cues of casual conversation and discussion with editors and owners. What topics to focus on, what particular portions of a story does the editor or owner view as important, how these owners might view the topics themselves, etc. The journalist, with these lessons, is going to act accordingly in their news coverage and thus contain themselves within an approved frame. The journalist will self-censor their work to meet the expectations of the editors and owners. It doesn't matter whether they genuinely believe their instances of self-censorship is actually them just being realistic and unbiased, or whether they consciously recognize that if they want to keep their job and move up the ladder, they've got to bite their tongue from time to time. The end result is the same: a journalist who keeps themselves within an approved frame. Beyond the immediate imposition of the capitalist frame from owners above, capitalist society itself exerts a pressure on the news media to present reality within a particular frame. For one, we have to understand the class background of many journalists themselves. Journalists are drawn from much more privileged sects of the working class and petty bourgeoisie for a variety of factors: the hiring process itself, privileged educational opportunities, the cushy wealth needed to take unpaid internships, and so on. And for a variety of factors, these journalists, on the whole, if not outrightly pro-capitalist in their world outlook, are no more than reformists, seeking a kinder capitalism. In addition to the privileged class backgrounds of many journalists, it's the wealthy business owners who ultimately dictate which journalists will succeed in the industry as a whole, which journalists find prestige and recognition through the various luxurious awards and ceremonies that are funded and awarded. Those journalists most aggressively sycophantic towards the interests of capital find themselves propelled to the heights of tiered media. We also need to examine the journalist education process. Staffed by seasoned journalists, academics, guest seminars by prestigious journalists, and so on, all instill a demand for objectivity and unbiased reporting in journalists. But when you examine what is considered objective and unobjective, it becomes clear that it is capitalist assumptions which are taught to be objective. Challenges to these cold facts are unobjective, and you're going to make a poor journalist. Everyone knows socialism doesn't work. That's just common sense. You link homelessness to the commodification of housing? Can we tone this down just a little bit? Oh, you call scary brown person from the global south thwarting our nation's imperialist ambitions a dictator and not a president? This is very objective. Good job. So the common sense and assumptions of journalists are to be set firmly within the capitalist frame. One of the most important points I need to touch on is the relationship between the state and news media under capitalism. For those of you who haven't, I'd encourage you to watch my video describing the state under capitalism. In it, I detail how, far from being a democracy, states under capitalism protect and advance the interests of those with the wealth and capital to afford its representation. The state under capitalism becomes a tool of the capitalist class. Now, far from being an antagonistic relationship between journalists and the state, journalists are forced to keep friendly ties and relationships with State Department actors and government officials if they want to keep their access to scoops and sources. Hence, in their reporting, journalists experience a real pressure to avoid heavy criticisms of their sources. Often, these journalists might just verbatim report the statements of police departments, intelligence officials, and government officials without challenging any of their assumptions. These kinds of journalists effectively become mouthpieces for the capitalist state, and government officials are aware of this and know how to play the media. This is how states manufacture consent for their wars. To feed alarming and villainizing reports about a foreign government or leader, even if these reports are themselves unsubstantiated, it doesn't matter. The media can be counted on to regurgitate these justifications for military aggression to the public, setting the frame of reality within which discussion and debate about war and aggression are to be had. Quick side note, this is one of the many ways straight-up fabrications about reality are picked up and broadcasted by the news media. It's not that the news media sets out to lie to the public, but that the bar for proof is very low when it comes to statements from the government and any story which seems to confirm a capitalist bias, while at the same time, the bar for proof when it comes to stories which seem to challenge a capitalist bias is extremely high. So the media will often propagate stories which end up being falsehoods, and slander stories which end up being true. But the damage has already been done, and those fabrications about reality remain as fact in the minds of the majority. In discussing these dynamics, we can come to see that despite not being privately owned and run for profit, non-profit news outlets and state media under capitalism will still propagate a capitalist frame. These outlets are hiring these same privileged journalists from the same schools of journalism with the same concepts about what is and isn't objective reporting, and reliant on the state for scoops and sources. Alright, so we understand what is meant by the capitalist frame of reality, and we understand how private ownership over the means of mass communication and operation under capitalism distorts reality towards this frame. So when you read the news, you need to keep in mind that what you're reading are capitalist understandings of reality, especially when it comes to topics which touch heavily on the class conflict. The narratives you are presented with will villainize and demean those actors, events, and movements which thwart or hinder the interests of capital. With equal vigor, media narratives will glorify, apologize, and justify those actors, events, and movements which advance or maintain the interests of capital. These conceptions about reality, which are propagated by the news media, not only bear consequences for us here and now, but go on to form the narratives of history we tell tomorrow. So even the histories we have been told are burdened by these capitalist biases, distortions, and outright fabrications. Now, if you yourself own productive property and employ others, the media as it stands now serves you nicely, and there's no need for anything to be done. The news genuinely reflects your world outlook and interests, and so too do the histories we construct. But if you're one of the schlubs who has to work for a living, you need to ask yourself, do you want a media that rambles on about soaring stock markets while ignoring the material needs of everyday folk? A media which follows this or that tech billionaire who's going to swoop in and save us from climate catastrophe? A media who on command eagerly beats the drums of war? Or do you want a media which earnestly reports on the things that matter to us? A media which gives room to debate on the questions that matter to us? A media whose operating objective is not profit, but service to the people? The means of mass communication must be freed from the private domination of individuals who propagate their own narratives of narrow interests. The means of mass communication must come under the democratic control of the working people and thus operated in service to the people. This, of course, would be part of a much larger upheaval in which the economy itself is seized from the private domination and control of petty tyrants and put under the democratic control of the working people, establishing an economy run by the people in service to the people. Let's turn to a quick example. A lot has opened up in the city's downtown. Under a capitalist economy, the lot's owner sells or rents the property to the highest bidder, and that bidding capitalist builds whatever they calculate will return to them the most profit, maybe another bank or something. The capitalist media will report on said building, and that'll be the extent of it. Maybe a mumble or two about job creation and how grateful we should all be. Under a democratically run society, a socialist society, debate about what is to be built in this empty lot is open to the public. A debate which is publicized through the means of mass communication so that all can follow the ongoing discussion and participate. What does the community need most in that lot? What can be done to raise the quality of life? Another high school? Another hospital? Maybe a new recreational facility? The cases can be made by the public through the media. After a given period of public debate, the votes can be taken, and thus the public will has been expressed and will be executed. The media, which is in service to the people, will continue to keep the public informed on how the projects are running, the results, and the lessons that can be drawn to inform our future decisions. Of course, this is just an example of how the media could be used under a democratic society. There's a lot that still needs to be done, and many obstacles which must be overcome before we can achieve this. In summary, capitalist media is a fuck, long live the workers' revolution. These are the socialist legends who have chosen to support me on Patreon, and you too can join the club for as little as $1 a month. For as little as $1 a month? For as little as $1 a month. Help support socialist content on YouTube. Also make sure to follow me on Twitter, and of course subscribe for more leftist content.